Hey, welcome to the last meeting of this academic year of the Gonzaga Socratic Club. We're glad you're here. The Socratic Club has been in existence for 18 years now. I can hardly believe it, but doing mostly talks from faculty here at Gonzaga, from regional universities, and occasionally from folks from far-flung places. The Socratic Club, in case you've wondered, it gets its strange name. It's not a club. We don't have a secret handshake. You don't have to become a member. We get our name from the Oxford Socratic Club of the mid-1900s, where famous Christian apologist C.S. Lewis was the president for a number of years. The club was started in Oxford to provide a conversational forum for people with really, there were all kinds of clubs at Oxford at the time. It was, of course, before television. Well, television was beginning to emerge by the time the Socratic Club ended, but before the sorts of things that entertain most of us. And so students and faculty gathering for academic intellectual talks was the order of the day. They met once a week, which seems very ambitious. We try to do once a month or so. But if you're interested in looking at, we address, kind of like the Oxford Socratic Club did, we address Christian worldview issues from a broadly philosophical point of view. So that often means looking at defenses or analyses of Christian belief, Christian philosophical worldview ideas, but it also sometimes means looking at criticisms or alternative views, like a recent talk we had on naturalism, for example. The club has been doing a series on human nature this past year that has included talks on evolution in human nature, on dualism in human nature, recently hylomorphism, and I also mentioned naturalism. So if you're interested in looking at some of those, talks are typically archived. We have a nice follow-up to this series that we've been doing on human nature. I started talking to, our speaker is Dr. Jake Tuttle. I started talking to him, it seems like it was about a year ago, and we started floating some ideas about a talk on hylomorphism and resurrection, and Dr. Tuttle decided to focus on Thomas's view of bodily existence in heaven, according to Christian doctrine. So his talk is Seeing God Face to Face, Thomas Aquinas on Human Nature, Heaven, and the Body. Dr. Tuttle is a lecturer here at Gonzaga, where he has been a lecturer since fall of 2018. He's taught at a number of other Catholic institutions, including most recently before Gonzaga, he was at Loyola Marymount. His PhD is from Purdue University. He wrote a dissertation on Suarez, and he's very interested in late medieval metaphysics, theory of reality, especially causation. So with that, Dr. Tuttle, we'd like to hear from you.
Thank you. So I want to thank all of you for coming during a busy time of the year and on a kind of a foul evening. I'm going to present this talk on Thomas Aquinas' views about human nature, heaven, and the body. This is kind of a work in progress, and so I'm especially interested to hear your questions and comments at the end. So Mark Twain is sometimes reported to have said, "If I cannot drink bourbon and smoke cigars in heaven, then I shall not go." This probably apocryphal quotation captures an intuition that many people have about happiness, namely that in order for a person to be completely happy, he or she must enjoy the goods of the body. Accordingly, if heaven is a state of maximal happiness, it should include the sorts of sensible pleasures that we enjoy in this life. At first glance, this intuition also seems to fit well with Christian teaching. In contrast to some accounts of reality that denigrate the material world, Christianity emphasizes the goodness of God's creation, including the goodness of our bodies and their associated activities. Indeed, Christianity values the body so highly that it insists upon the resurrection of the dead. In light of these doctrines, it's not surprising that many Christians expect that the blessed in heaven will eat, drink, play sports, and even have sex. Perhaps bourbon and cigars aren't out of the question either. However, a long tradition of Christian philosophers and theologians has rejected the idea that beatitude includes the goods of the body. One such figure is the medieval Catholic thinker, St. Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas argues that the blessed in heaven will have perfect resurrected bodies. However, he also insists that our beatitude will not include any bodily activity. Instead, the blessed in heaven will be totally occupied with contemplating God's essence. He calls this eternal act of contemplation the beatific vision. On Aquinas' view, our enjoyment of this good will be self-sufficient or lacking in nothing. Aquinas' account of heaven has puzzled some scholars because it seems to render the body otios. What's the point of having a resurrected body if it will not do anything? This problem seems especially serious in light of Aquinas' hylomorphic theory of human nature, according to which a human being is composed of a body and a rational immaterial soul. On Aquinas' view, part of what it is to be human is to have a body. So it might look surprising that the beatific vision, which is supposed to fully satisfy our deepest desires, should not include any bodily activity. In my talk, I argue that Aquinas resolves this tension by appealing to the Christian notion of divinization, namely, that the blessed in heaven come to more closely resemble God than is possible in this earthly life. The talk sort of has three broad parts. So in the beginning, I'm going to talk about some of the Aristotelian background that informs Aquinas' views. So in addition to being influenced by Christianity, Aquinas is also deeply influenced by the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle. And then in the next part of the talk, I'm going to outline Aquinas' view about heaven and beatitude. And then in the final part of the talk, I'm going to raise and try to address this objection that has to do with the role of the body in heaven. So Aristotle begins his ethical work, the Nicomachean Ethics, with the sweeping observation that every human action and every branch of knowledge appears to be aimed at some good. Some of these goods appear to be products, such as the products of a craft, or things as considerable as victory. Others appear to be certain sorts of activity themselves, say sports or other leisure activities. But one thing I should mention is there's a handout, David.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
So thank you, David. So I printed optimistically 100 handouts, so you can each have 5. But the handout has some of the texts that I'll be quoting. So some of the longer quotes will be on there, and you can follow along there. So other human actions that appear to be, aimed at some good are, certain sorts of activities themselves, say sports or other leisure activities. Aristotle's point then is that human action, knowledge, and decision-making are all goal-oriented. All of these things aim at what we take to be good. Now, in light of this, it's natural to wonder if there must be one or more highest goods for the sake of which every other good is pursued. And Aristotle famously argues that there must be, because if there were not, then there would be no ultimate reason why we pursue any of the goods that we do pursue. So Aristotle has this kind of famous argument in book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics, that there must be some highest good that we pursue, because otherwise everything we pursue would be in vain. So moral philosophers sometimes talk about the difference between what's called instrumental value and intrinsic value. So instrumental value is the kind of value that something has because it's useful for securing something else. So a kind of a common example of instrumental value would be something like money. Whereas intrinsic value is the kind of value that something has for its own sake or in its own right. And Aristotle argues that if there's such a thing as instrumental value, there must be such a thing as intrinsic value, because instrumental value is derivative upon intrinsic value. So there's ultimately no explanation, he thinks, for why there's instrumental value if there's no intrinsic value. Now, given that there is such a highest good toward which all our knowledge and action is aimed, surely if we could figure out what this good is and what branch of knowledge is concerned with it, this would be valuable information. Aristotle notes that this knowledge will carry great weight for our way of life and would make us better able, like archers who have a target to aim at, to hit the right mark. In chapter 4 of book 1, Aristotle points out that almost everyone agrees that this highest good is happiness. Now, the term that's being translated here as happiness is the Greek term eudaimonia, which is more literally rendered as flourishing or doing well. And this is why immediately after pointing out that virtually everyone believes happiness to be the highest good, Aristotle notes that they suppose that living well and doing well are the same as being happy. For Aristotle and ancient Greeks more generally, the happy or eudaimon person lives a good or successful life. This is, as the scholar Urmson puts it, the sort of life that we would want for our children. So if you're trying to envision what the eudaimon life is, envision what kind of life you would want for your children. Now, Aristotle notes that although everyone agrees that happiness, understood in this sense, is the highest good, there's nevertheless a lot of disagreement about what happiness or eudaimonia amounts to. Starting in chapter 7, Aristotle begins to develop a fairly specific account of eudaimonia and how it's acquired. Near the beginning of chapter 7, he identifies 2 desiderata that he thinks the correct account of eudaimonia must satisfy. So these are sort of like 2 tests that the correct account needs to meet. The first is that eudaimonia must be something complete or self-sufficient in the sense that it lacks nothing. He says, we regard something as self-sufficient when all by itself it makes a life choice-worthy and lacking nothing. And the idea here is that the ideal of the eudaimon life is an ideal that cannot be improved upon. When we envision a good life, we envision the best sort of life, a life that cannot be improved upon by adding other goods. The second test is that the eudaimon life must be worthy of pursuit just for its own sake. Accordingly, eudaimonia should not be something that has mere instrumental value, such as money. Likewise, and this is a more subtle point, it also should not be something that has both instrumental and intrinsic value. As examples of such things, he cites honor, pleasure, understanding, and every virtue, which we would pursue for our own sakes, but which he also thinks we pursue for the sake of eudaimonia. Now, these tests are both going to be important for Aquinas, so I want you to keep these in mind: the self-sufficiency test and the what we might call the intrinsic value test. Around the middle of chapter 7, Aristotle says very specifically what he thinks the good life consists in. One crucial remark he makes is that perhaps then we shall find this if we first grasp the function of a human being. This is a very important but also very difficult remark, and it's worth spending some time to get clear on what Aristotle has in mind. The word that's being translated here as function is telos, which also means aim or purpose. Aristotle makes it clear that he thinks that the good for any given thing is determined by its function. So this is Aristotle's famous function argument, that the human being must have a function. Because different kinds of things have very different functions, the good for one thing may be very different than the good for another thing. This is why Aristotle thinks that good is an analogous term. Accordingly, in order to understand what the good for human beings is, we'll need to understand the function of human beings. This is a complicated point, but it's also the crux of Aristotle's entire account of happiness. For this reason, we'll need to discuss it in a bit of detail. We've seen so far that Aristotle thinks human disciplines and activities are done for the sake of certain ends. Another way of putting this is that these arts and sciences have some function or purpose. They are purposive or aimed at something. In chapter 7, Aristotle goes on to note that flute players, artists, sculptors, and carpenters each have a function too. As we might expect, the function of a flute player is to play the flute, and an artist to make art, etc. Likewise, the good for each of these craftsmen or professionals is to perform these activities and to perform them well. Aristotle notes that the various organs of human beings and other animals have functions too. Eyes, hands, and feet are all for something, and their good consists in their performing a certain kind of activity and performing it well. For example, the good of a kidney is to filter blood and to do it well. We say that something is a good kidney if and only if it does this. However, Aristotle now makes a significant jump. He wants to say that for human beings, there is a function. That is to say, human beings are for something, or they aim at something. From the perspective of a religious person, such as Aquinas, this may well seem reasonable. After all, many of the world's great religions teach that God made human beings for a purpose, and moreover, that he's revealed this purpose to us. In light of this, it's perhaps easy to understand why later religious thinkers such as Aquinas found Aristotle's teleological moral theory so attractive. However, Aristotle pretty clearly wasn't thinking of the human function in this religious way. While thinkers such as Aquinas would approach ethics from the perspective of theology, Aristotle appears to approach it from the perspective of biological science. His view is that the function of a particular organism consists in using the various capabilities and organs that are characteristic of an organism of that species, and moreover, in using them well. For example, the good of a duck will no doubt include flying and flying well, since ducks have wings and flight is the function of these wings. Likewise, we can plausibly say that if Aristotle were around today, he would insist that the good for a tree must involve photosynthesis, since this capacity is part of what is distinctive of trees. Accordingly, an understanding of the good for human beings requires an understanding of the organs and capabilities that are characteristic of human beings. Aristotle outlines these capabilities in his discussion of the traditional threefold division of the soul into the nutritive, appetitive, and rational. It's important to emphasize that Aristotle is here using the term soul very differently than we do nowadays. Ancient Greeks understood the soul to be whatever it is that explains why an organism is alive, and they thought it was an open question whether the soul is material or immaterial. Not surprisingly, Aristotle thinks that what's distinctive about humans is that they have a rational soul, which enables them to perform the kinds of activities that are characteristic of human life: deliberation, forming friendships, acquiring practical and theoretical knowledge, and so on. Aristotle concludes by offering a kind of preliminary definition of eudaimonia as activity of the soul in accordance with complete virtue or excellence over the course of a complete life. Now that we've seen Aristotle's view from book one, that the eudaimon life is a life of excellent activity, it's important to note a tension in the way Aristotle explains just what this activity consists in. Both contemporary scholars and historical interpreters such as Aquinas have noticed that Aristotle appears to sketch two very different portraits of the eudaimon life in different parts of the Nicomachean Ethics. In books 2 through 9, he outlines what scholars refer to as the active, civic, or political life. In this part of the text, he identifies and characterizes moral virtues such as courage, generosity, honesty, justice, temperance, and magnanimity. He also develops a detailed account of friendship and its role in a happy life. This long portion of the work is pretty clearly aimed at showing the reader how to be a good citizen within a political community. And indeed, Aristotle views the Nicomachean Ethics as part of the same project as the Politics, which is focused on achieving the good for a city. Moreover, this is a project that would have been highly relevant to Aristotle's students and their parents, and so is perhaps an early example of what's sometimes called student-centered pedagogy. However, in book 10, Aristotle outlines a very different account of a good life, which scholars often call the contemplative life or the life of study. There, he appears to argue that the most eudaimon life is the life of theoretical inquiry or study. Before getting into his reasons for this, it'll be helpful to clarify the difference between these two lives by considering two examples that were offered by one of my graduate school professors, the life of Gandhi and the life of Einstein. So you can think of Gandhi as being kind of paradigmatic of the political life or the active life, right? So he leads his community, at a difficult time in the life of the community, and his work is inherently social and ordered towards the good of his community. On the other hand, the life of study is maybe well illustrated by someone like Einstein, who's deeply engaged in theoretical research. Aristotle offers several reasons for preferring the life of study. But perhaps the most fundamental is that he thinks this sort of life manifests the excellence of the best part of us, namely our reason or understanding. So the first quote that I have for you in your handout, number 1, I'm going to read here. If happiness is activity in accord with virtue, it is reasonable for it to accord with the supreme virtue, which will be the virtue of the best thing. The best is understanding, or whatever else seems to be the natural ruler and leader. And to understand what is fine and divine by being itself either divine or the most divine element in us. Hence, complete happiness will be in its activity in accord with its most proper virtue. And we have said that this activity will be the activity of study. In addition to manifesting the excellence of the best part of us, Aristotle mentions a number of other reasons for preferring the life of study, 2 of which I'll quickly mention here. One is that it is the most self-sufficient, since it requires the least in terms of external goods. Another way of putting this is that the life of study seems to be the most complete life in itself. We might say that this sort of life is composed of fewer discrete elements, right? So it needs less in terms of other kinds of goods in order to be satisfying. The other is that the life of study seems to have less utility or instrumental value than the life of activity. The idea here is that the actions that constitute the political life, while being choice-worthy in themselves, are also choice-worthy for the sake of something else, presumably the good of the political community. And this is an indication that they are inferior kinds of action. So Aristotle has this kind of, I think from nowadays, our perspective, counterintuitive view that the less useful something is, the more valuable it is, right? Something that we would pursue entirely for its own sake must be the very most choice-worthy thing. Something that has even the smallest bit of instrumental value is going to be less valuable than something that's choice-worthy for its own sake. And that is the life of study, Aristotle thinks. One thing that's striking about Aristotle's short discussion of the life of study or contemplation is that he repeatedly characterizes it as divine or godlike. For example, he writes, and this is quote 2, such a life would be superior to the human level, for someone will live it not insofar as he is a human being, but insofar as he has some divine element in him. And the activity of this divine element is as much superior to the activity in accord with the rest of virtue as this element is superior to the compound. Hence, if understanding is something divine in comparison with a human being, so also will the life in accord with understanding to be divine in comparison with human life. As far as we can, we ought to be pro-immortal and go to all lengths to live life in accord with our supreme element. For however much this element may lack in bulk, by much more it surpasses everything in power and value. So Aristotle appears to think that such a life is godlike in 2 ways. First, in respect of the object of contemplation, what is being contemplated. And second, in terms of its continuity and independence from the practical considerations of everyday life. Considerations that involve care of the body, you have to take care of your body, and it's onerous to take care of your body, making money, tending to human relationships, and so on. As we'll see, I'm going to argue that this particular aspect of Aristotle's view is an important and overlooked influence on Aquinas' account of beatitude. So remember that Aristotle is constantly talking about the life of contemplation as being godlike or divine. So I'm now going to turn with this background in mind to Aquinas' views. So now that we've seen Aristotle's account of happiness, we're ready to turn to the details of Aquinas' account. As I've noted already, Aquinas' views are strongly influenced by Aristotle's. In his treatments of happiness or beatitude, he repeatedly refers to Aristotle's account. However, Aquinas is a Catholic theologian, and he is thus also, of course, guided by the Church's teaching on beatitude and good life. As in many other areas of his philosophy, Aquinas views Aristotle's account of happiness as reflecting what we might think of as human wisdom, what human beings can come to know about the world through natural reason, unaided by divine revelation. Accordingly, Aquinas agrees with Aristotle that happiness or the human good is going to consist in fulfilling the function or end of human beings, where this is to be understood in terms of the excellent use of the various organs and capabilities that are characteristic of human beings. Likewise, Aquinas acknowledges the division between the active or political life on the one hand and the contemplative life or life of study on the other. And like Aristotle, he clearly thinks the contemplative life is preferable. For example, in the Summa Theologiae, second part of the second part, question 182, he writes that, this is not on your handout, the contemplative life is better than the active life, absolutely speaking, he says. Even though he indicates elsewhere that he's prepared to grant that in some circumstances we might be morally required to pursue the active life. He thinks the contemplative life is better, all things considered. In the same passage, he identifies several arguments from Book 10 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, including the ones we've already seen, according to which the life of contemplation is more self-sufficient and is loved more for its sake. However, Aquinas also insists that the happiness outlined by Aristotle is imperfect or incomplete. In the text where he discusses beatitude, he repeatedly compares what he calls the imperfect beatitude of this life with the perfect beatitude of the next. For example, in one passage from the Summa Theologiae, first part of the second part, question 4, he writes that there are two sorts of beatitude. The one which is had in this life is imperfect, and the other, which consists in the act of seeing God, is perfect. This is perhaps not surprising. After all, Christianity teaches that human beings were made to worship God and to have a certain sort of relationship with him, and that these conditions receive their full expression in eternal life in heaven. Drawing on passages from the Bible and elsewhere in the Christian tradition, Aquinas often describes the perfect beatitude of heaven in terms of seeing God, and sometimes more specifically in terms of seeing God's face. For example, in his discussion of beatitude, Aquinas repeatedly refers to 1 Corinthians 13:12, where St. Paul writes, and I've got a series of quotes here for you, so you can follow along with these. At present, we see indistinctly as in a mirror, but then face to face. At present, I know partially, then I shall know fully. In this passage, St. Paul is himself likely drawing on passages from the Old Testament that refer to seeing God's face. For example, from Genesis, Jacob named the place Peniel, because I have seen God face to face, he said, and yet my life has been spared. Next, many say, may we see better times. This is from the Psalms. Lord, show us the light of your face. And then from Ezekiel, no longer will I hide my face from them, for I have poured out my spirit upon the house of Israel, says the Lord God. And here's an example of the earlier theologian, St. Anselm, characterizing our happiness in terms of seeing God's face. And this is number 7 under handout. What shall your servant do, deeply troubled by his love for you and banished from your face? He longs to see you, but your face is too far away from him. He desires to approach your presence, but your dwelling is unapproachable. He wants to find you, but he does not know where you are. He aspires to seek you, but he does not know your face. Lord, you are my God and you are my Lord, but I have never seen you. I was created so that I might see you, but I have not yet done what I was created to do. It's important to note that Aquinas does not think that in heaven we'll literally see God or God's face. So this is your 8th quotation here. So in Summa Theologiae Part 1, question 12, he writes, it's impossible for God to be seen with the sense of sight or with any other sense or power that belongs to the sentient part of the soul. For, as will be explained below, every power of this sort is the act of a bodily organ. But an act is proportioned to that of which it is the act. Hence, no power of the sort in question can extend itself beyond corporeal things. But as was shown above, God is incorporeal. Therefore, he can be seen neither by the senses nor by the imagination, but only by the intellect. So the main point here is that God is immaterial. So we should not expect a bodily organ to be able to perceive him. There is an interesting question about whether we'll literally see Christ in heaven. Although I don't know what Aquinas says about this, I'd be pretty surprised if the answer were no. But at least as far as God is concerned, God understood, as God himself. Aquinas thinks we won't literally see God. Instead, Aquinas insists that passages from scripture and tradition that refer to our seeing God should be understood figuratively, to mean that we shall know God. More specifically, he appeals to the technical terminology of Aristotelianism to express this point, claiming that our perfect beatitude consists in knowing God's essence. In Aristotelian philosophy, the essence of a thing is the what it is to be that thing. It most fundamentally captures a thing's nature or character. So, for example, Aristotle famously argues that the essence of a human being is to be a rational animal. That's how he defines a human being. By knowing this essence, Aristotle thinks we have a deep insight into or understanding of human nature. In Summa Theologiae, the first part of the second part, question 3, Aquinas argues in a way that's reminiscent of Aristotle's book 10. He claims that knowing God's essence is our highest good because first, it's the most self-sufficient good available to us. And second, it perfects our intellect or understanding to a greater extent than any other good can. So Aquinas' explanation of these points is a bit complicated, but I think his view is that the function of our faculty of intellect is to know or understand the truth. But if our knowledge of the world extends only to the things that God has created, rather than to God himself, our intellect will inevitably lack something that's required for fulfilling its function or end. In this sense, it will remain imperfect, and as a result, will inevitably remain unsatisfied with our limited understanding. Aquinas writes, and this is number 9. Therefore, what is required for perfect beatitude is that the intellect should reach the very essence of the first cause. And so it will have its perfection by being united to God as its object. And as was explained above, this alone is what man's beatitude consists of. Aquinas argues that perfect beatitude cannot be had in this life. One reason he offers for this is that perfect beatitude, as he puts it, excludes every evil and fulfills every desire. Whereas in this life, there are inevitably some evils, and our desires are inevitably thwarted to some extent. Regarding the second point, Aquinas emphasizes that the goods of this life are transitory, whereas we desire that they be permanent. Although Aquinas doesn't explicitly make this point in the passage I mentioned, there are some obvious parallels with Aristotle's discussion of the contemplative life in Book 10. There, Aristotle regrets that the activity of contemplation is inevitably episodic because it must be interrupted by practical considerations. For example, we need to care for our bodies, earn a living, and maintain human relationships. No doubt, our contemplation of God's essence must also suffer these shortcomings in the present life. And this is one reason why Aquinas notes in his discussion of the contemplative life that in this life, contemplation amounts only to a certain inchoate beatitude. But in heaven, our contemplation of God will be eternal and uninterrupted. Aquinas calls this singular act of contemplation the beatific vision. Now that we've outlined Aquinas' basic account of perfect beatitude, we're ready to turn to the questions about the goods of the body that I raised at the beginning. So, what you're all wondering, will there be bourbon and cigars? What role does Aquinas envision for the body in perfect beatitude? Will we enjoy the goods of the body for which we care so much in this life? It will be helpful to begin by responding to 2 alternative accounts of beatitude that Aquinas considers, the first of which I'll call the bodily goods account. So in the first part of the second part of the Summa, question 2, Aquinas considers the disputed question whether our beatitude lies in any bodily good. According to one especially interesting argument he considers for this view, the goods of the body, and especially health, are necessary in order to exist and to live, and accordingly appear to be requirements for our attaining any other goods. And so it might make sense to say that beatitude consists of such things as health, fitness, and other bodily goods. I'll say, incidentally, this position sort of reminds me of the contemporary wellness movement, where people are very focused on health and fitness and bodily goods. Now, according to one response that Aquinas offers, this account is incorrect because it fails to appreciate that the goods of the human soul are higher than the goods of the body. He writes, and this is quote 10, "The body itself exists for the sake of the soul, in the way that matter exists for the sake of form, and in the way that instruments exist for the sake of the mover, in order that the mover might exercise its actions toward them. Hence, all bodily goods are ordered toward the goods of the soul as toward their end. Hence, it is impossible for beatitude, which is the ultimate end, to lie in the goods of the body." Now, what Aquinas seems to be saying here is that even if the goods of the body have some intrinsic value, they're nevertheless instrumentally valuable for securing the goods of the soul. But as we've seen, according to the Aristotelian framework that Aquinas adopts, our highest good will have only intrinsic value, not instrumental value. It will not be useful for anything. It bears emphasizing that Aquinas' point will presumably extend to the so-called external goods that contribute to the goods of the body. For example, things such as good food, clean water, adequate clothing, adequate housing, healthcare, and so on. To the extent that these things are ordered towards the goods of the body, they will have instrumental value, and so fail the test of being valuable just for their own sake. In a nearby passage, Aquinas makes a related argument against the view that beatitude consists in bodily pleasure. Let's call this the life of pleasure account. Aquinas understands such pleasures as resulting from bodily goods being apprehended by our sense organs. For example, when we take pleasure in eating lasagna, this results from our sense organs apprehending that the lasagna is good for the body. Don't let anyone tell you that it's not. Aquinas understands bodily pleasure as a specific variant of what he calls delight, which results from our apprehension of any good that accrues to us. He argues plausibly that our delight will be better to the extent that it results from apprehension of a better good. But since the goods of the soul are higher than the goods of the body, clearly our delight in bodily goods is not a strong candidate for beatitude. This argument rules out our beatitude consisting in the pleasures of things like food, drink, sex, and so on. It bears emphasizing that these alternative accounts of beatitude are very crude. Aquinas argues persuasively that the beatific vision is a better candidate for beatitude than the life of pleasure or the life of wellness. Whatever else we can say about beatitude, it won't consist in an eternal bachelor party or an eternal trip to a wellness spa. Even so, one might well wonder whether the goods and pleasures of the body have some role in our perfect beatitude. So you might think our perfect beatitude doesn't completely consist in the goods of the body, but that maybe they play some part in the goods of the body, or some part in beatitude. So, just as it seems plausible that pleasure and bodily wellness play some role, though not an exhaustive one, in our happiness in this life, so it seems that they should in the next life. Indeed, one might employ the self-sufficiency test here. Surely, if heaven does not include these goods, then our beatitude would be somehow incomplete, and we could reasonably ask for more. Surely Twain is right that we should expect bourbon and cigars. I'm actually reminded here of the early video game Tuttle, where the character plays the entire game and gets to the end. He says, "I was told there'd be cake," right? And there's no cake, and he's disappointed. So, you might think heaven is like that. Look, I was told that there would be pleasures of the body. When you get there, there's none. All you got is God. Perhaps wisely, Aquinas is somewhat vague about what heaven will be like. Even so, it's pretty clear that he'd reject even this more limited account of the role of bodily pleasures and bodily wellness in perfect beatitude. So consider the following passage. This is, I think, passage 11, where Aquinas considers whether man's beatitude lies in any created good. He says, "It is impossible for man's beatitude to lie in any created good. For beatitude is a perfect good that puts the appetite totally to rest. It would not be the ultimate end otherwise, i.e., if something remained to be desired. But the object of the will, which is man's appetite, is the universal good. just as the object of the intellect is universal truth. From this, it is clear that nothing can put man's will to rest except the universal good. But the universal good is found only in God and not in any created good, since every creature has participated goodness. Hence, only God can satisfy man's will. This, according to Psalm 102, verse 5, he satisfies your desire for good things. Therefore, it is in God alone that man's beatitude lies. So in this passage, Aquinas turns our application of the self-sufficiency test on its head. The beatific vision will not be lacking anything if it is deprived of pleasure or the goods of the body or any other created thing. After all, it is only God who can totally satisfy us. Aquinas emphasizes this even more explicitly in Summa Contra Gentiles. After noting that in our resurrected state, we will not have any need for food, drink, or sex, since our bodies will be incorruptible and there will be no reproduction. Aquinas emphasizes that we will not seek these things just for the sake of pleasure either. He writes, this is number 12, it appears ridiculous to seek bodily delights in which we share with brute animals, where there are expected the highest delights in which we share with the angels, which are in the vision of God. Aquinas' point seems to be that when presented with an infinite good, there's no sense in bothering with seeking out a finite one. In one passage, Aquinas actually argues that having a body isn't even required for beatitude. The theological motivation for this is that he wants to say that we can be beatified in the so-called interim state, after death, but before the resurrection of the body. And he argues from natural reason that since the body doesn't actually contribute anything to the sort of knowledge that we'll have of God in the beatific vision, we could have this knowledge even before our bodies are resurrected. Of course, Aquinas does think that we'll have resurrected bodies in heaven, and he has a fair bit to say about what these bodies will be like. Because of limitations of time, I won't go into this in much detail, but Aquinas thinks our resurrected bodies will be tangible, living, incorruptible, immortal bodies. He also thinks they will not be capable of suffering, that they will be able to move easily with great agility, that they will not suffer any defect or disease. And he also thinks, this is maybe a little bit surprising, that our bodies will literally shine or glow. So I can talk to you about why I think he thinks that later on. But there's actually, partly because of this, there's this kind of famous article on Aquinas on Beatitude called Aquinas' Shiny Happy People, because we'll literally shine or glow. So our bodies will be awesome with all the powers we have in this life and then some. Even so, the role that our bodies will play in our beatified life will be extremely circumscribed. Although Aquinas doesn't quite say that we won't engage in any bodily activity, his discussion makes clear that the sorts of activities and amusements towards which we gravitate in this life will no longer hold any attraction for us. Because we will have been presented with an infinite good, we'll simply no longer have the appetite for things like food and drink, sex, sports, and so on. I hope that having seen Aquinas' reasons for this view helps to motivate it to some extent as well. In particular, I find it helpful to recall that even on Aristotle's view, the contemplative life really only involves minimal consideration for the body. And many of the limits and drawbacks that Aristotle regrets about this life concern our need to care for the body. In the Christian account of the resurrection of the dead, Aquinas finds a compelling way to remove this impediment to the contemplative life once and for all. Nevertheless, one might worry that Aquinas' account of beatitude renders the body otiose. As I put it in the introduction, what's the point of having a resurrected body if it doesn't do anything, or at least doesn't contribute in any meaningful way to our happiness? This would perhaps be less problematic if Aquinas held a substance dualist theory of human nature. According to such a theory, the soul and the body are distinct substances. Many substance dualists also hold the view that we are really identical to our immortal souls. Our bodies belong to us, but they are not who we are or what we are. However, Aquinas famously holds a hylomorphic account of human nature. He believes that human beings are composites of an immaterial soul and a material body. Accordingly, on his view, part of what it is to be a human being is to have a body. In fact, there's a passage in the Summa where Aquinas famously insists the soul is not the man. I once said this so many times in a medieval philosophy class that my students made me a bumper sticker that they gave me. It said, the soul is not the man. This view fits quite naturally with Aristotle's account of eudaimonia as a life that consists of excellent manifestations of the full suite of human capacities, including our bodily capacities. That is, the hylomorphic account of human nature. For this reason, some scholars have found it surprising that Aquinas offers such a circumscribed account of the role that the body plays in perfect beatitude. So Aquinas' account of the role of the body, it's not contradictory or inconsistent in any way, but it just doesn't seem to sit very well with his hylomorphic account of human nature. It's a little bit surprising. In perhaps the most well-known presentation of this worry, titled Aquinas' Shiny Happy People, Perfect Happiness and the Limits of Human Nature, Christina Van Dyke argues, and this is your quote 13, Aquinas' account of the beatific vision suggests that perfect happiness represents less a fulfillment of human nature than a transcendence of what it means to be human. In particular, his emphasis on the radical all-sufficiency of the beatific vision leaves him with an integral role for the body to play, or leaves him, without an integral role for the body to play in our final end. So Van Dyke regards this as a serious problem for Aquinas' account. However, I want to argue, and I think pretty informally and perhaps in an underdeveloped way, so this is a kind of a work in progress, that transcending human nature in the way that Aquinas envisions is not, after all, a bad thing. It is, on my view, a feature of his theory rather than a bug. I'm not aware of any scholarship that discusses this, but it seems to me pretty clear that Aquinas is well aware of the fact that his account of beatitude involves human beings transcending their nature. Now, mind you, he doesn't think that we cease to be human. He's not, for example, what philosophers nowadays call a transhumanist, who thinks it's possible for us to transcend our human nature and cease to be human. However, Aquinas clearly does think that in experiencing the beatific vision, the part of ourselves which is most noble and dignified becomes amped up or maximized in a way that is impossible in this life. This is the rational, immaterial part of us. Although we still have our glorified bodies in heaven, it's our rational souls that are the driving force behind our perfect happiness. And it's our soul's two characteristic powers, the will and the intellect, that are fully manifested. And in fact, on Aquinas' view, they are manifested in ways that would be impossible without specific enhancements that are given to us by God. I think Aquinas' views about this are best understood within the context of the traditional Christian doctrine of divinization, namely the doctrine that in heaven we will become like God. As we've seen, Aristotle suggests that there's something godlike in the contemplative life. And this is something that Aquinas also mentions repeatedly and explicitly in his discussion of perfect beatitude. So, for example, in part 1 of the Summa, question 12, Aquinas argues that we are able to know God's essence only through a supernatural power added to the intellect, which he calls the illumination of the intellect. In discussing the supernatural power, he writes, and this is your final quote, quote 14, by this light, the blessed are made godlike, i.e. similar to God. This according to 1 John chapter 3, verse 2. When he shall appear, we shall be like to him, and we shall see him as he is. Aquinas also makes similar remarks in a number of other passages where he describes our knowledge of God in the beatific vision. He repeatedly emphasizes that in order to know God, we must become like God. Once put in this light, I think this aspect of Aquinas' theory of beatitude is not obviously problematic. In the first place, it surely seems like a benefit to the person who undergoes such a transformation. Moreover, it doesn't involve any repudiation of the body or anything like that. You still got a body. In fact, it's an awesome, perfect body. Finally, and I think this is the most important part, I think we can make a convincing case that in perfect beatitude, our human nature is brought to its fulfillment. And this is where I disagree with Van Dyke. This is because what is most human about us, our will and intellect, comes to dominate our life and activity. So although there is some sense in which we're transcending our human nature, we do this by overcoming the various limitations of our bodies and thereby experiencing an infinite good. On Aquinas' view, in our beatitude, we discover who we really are and what our human nature is really capable of. So I'm going to end by appealing to a very cheesy kind of metaphor. So think of a caterpillar and its transformation into a butterfly, right? It doesn't make sense for us to look at the butterfly and say, you know, it's no longer doing its caterpillar things. It's no longer crawling around on the ground, right? That doesn't seem like the right thing to say, right? The caterpillar is now a butterfly. It's doing its butterfly things. It's become something that seems better, right? But it's not in any way, you know, it seems to me it hasn't lost anything, right? It's becoming what it really is and what it was supposed to be all along. So I think that's how Aquinas understands divinization and how he would respond to this objection that the body is otios. It's not that the body is bad. In fact, he thinks it's good. It's so good that it needs to be resurrected. But the driving force behind our happiness is going to be our understanding of who God is. And so that's, I think, Aquinas' view and how he would try to resolve that problem. Okay, so I'm done now. Again, this is a work in progress, so I'm interested in hearing, you know, your thoughts and questions. So thanks for your attention.
If you'd like, I'll let you field the questions. So
Sure, that sounds good.
there are some faculty here. I'd like the faculty not to ask a question first, so let students have a chance. Far away.
Yeah.
So I've heard it said that Aquinas says that in heaven we won't have knowledge of everything, but only knowledge is that which is necessary for us to know. So wait, what exactly does that mean? What would be knowledge that isn't necessary for us to know versus like necessary knowledge?
Yeah. So I'm not familiar with that specific remark. There's a lot that Aquinas has to say about beatitude. I mean, it's a really important topic of a number of theological works. And so, you know, I'm not sure that I can give an informed answer about that. One thing I'll say is it's likely if he talks about that you'd find it in the first part of the Summa where he talks about knowledge of God. So this is question 12. Yeah. So there is a kind of question whether we see created things in God. I have a kind of a vague recollection of this, but I don't remember exactly what he says about that. I think he thinks that we do understand created things in God in some way. But yeah, so I'm sorry I can't say too specifically. Yeah.
So I was just wondering, but in our holy, glorious, awesome resurrected body, do you know like what age it would be? Because technically, like biologically, like as you progress through lifetime, you accumulate mutations, which kind of like, if you think about it, would be less human functioning. So like it wouldn't like, I guess, really be the fulfilling your telos. And so like, would you be, I guess, reduced back to your prime?
Yeah.
You know, like, I don't know, 12? I don't know.
So, so there are a couple things that are important. So one thing is Aquinas says you will have no defect, right? So presumably if you have some kind of genetic problem in this life, you won't have it. But he does in the Summa Contra Gentiles talk about the age. And you know, if you have a resurrected body, it's got to have some age or other. And he considers different options. And ultimately what he says is you will be the age of Christ. And he doesn't say exactly what that is, but I assume that means the age of Christ during his ministry, right? And he says there are some advantages. You're not too young, because if you're too young, you're immature and your body is imperfect in some ways. But if you're too old, you become infirm and you know, you're imperfect in that way too. So he says the best thing is to be the age of Christ, which I take it is like, you know, early 30s. So if you're in your early 30s right now, if there's anyone in this room, you know, you've got it, right? That's what you'll be like in heaven. Yeah.
Just a follow-up question, but like, what if you die early? You get like progressed, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I take it that he thinks, and you know, I'd have to look more carefully at this. You know, some of these specific questions he considers very, very quickly, because I mean, what he's really concerned about is the beatific vision. So I think he regards these questions about the body as kind of interesting, but ultimately distracting. I think he thinks that, you know, if you die young, you'll end up still being in your early 30s, because that's the best age. That's the maximum. That's the most perfect age for you. Yeah.
Just kind of follow up on that one. If he says that you have no defects, is that like a physical thing? Is that like if you have a mental defect in your like regular life, is that carry on over?
So I take it that he means that you will have no kind of disease or infirmity or defect of any kind, right? Now Aquinas's view is that all of those things stem from, at least unless we're talking about moral problems, if we're just talking about health, all of those kinds of defects stem somehow from the body. So like he thinks that, you know, if someone has a cognitive disability, that's a problem with the body. It's not a problem with their soul, or so the body is somehow blocking the proper function of a person's intellect or something. And he thinks in heaven you won't have anything like that. So no illness or defect of any kind. You know, he says some interesting things. No one's asked about the glowing yet, but he finds this passage from, I think, the Gospel of Matthew that says something like, we shall shine forth. You might wonder whether it'd be better to interpret that figuratively or something, but there are other passages in the scripture where people are exposed to God somehow and they're said to shine. So like Moses, when he meets God, his face is shining. And then also in the transfiguration, you know, someone's face glows. So I think Aquinas thinks, you know, you've got sort of revealed reasons for thinking that we will glow. And so this is why you have this title of this article, Aquinas is shining happy people. So we will literally be resplendent. Yes.
Like really mix the body into like you lost it. Because I think like in Revelation, there are classical like those who are martyrs or like there's like the saints like carrying his head after it's been chopped off.
Yeah, this is an interesting question, and I'm not completely sure what to say about this. I would expect sort of that, like when we see Christ in heaven, he will have his wounds, for example. Like it would be surprised if he didn't. So I'd also be interested to know if that martyr is carrying around his head, like you know, like that. You know, that, what is that story? Is it Washington Irving, the Headless Horseman? Yeah.
So the illumination of the intellect in order to see the Trinity, is there anything here on earth that's sort of like analogous to this sort of sense, or is there no way of really approaching it?
So this is hard, and like I'm not an expert on Aquinas's epistemology, and so there are people who know a lot more about this than I do. Like, for example, Christina Van Dyke, who wrote this article. Aquinas talks about in the Summa about what he calls rapture. And what he means by that is people who have visions of God in this life. And so he mentions Moses and St. Paul specifically. And he talks there about whether this is exactly like what we'll experience in heaven or in what ways it's different. And I don't remember exactly what his view is about that. He seems to think, you know, whatever else we say, this is similar to what happens in the beatific vision in heaven. But I think he also thinks that, I suspect he thinks that there are some important differences as well. One kind of analogous thing in the moral sense is that Aquinas seems to think God illuminates our intellect by sort of adding an additional power to it in heaven. This is it's sort of, I think, analogous to what happens when we receive the theological virtues, right? So these are infused virtues. They come to us through God's grace. And that causes us to have a different kind of outlook on the world, a different moral approach. And so there's a kind of analogy there. But Aquinas is pretty cagey about what the beatific vision is actually like. And I I think probably wisely, he doesn't try to describe it to us or tell us exactly what it's going to be like. Yeah, so I don't know what it's like to have one's intellect be, enhanced by God so that we can directly appreciate his essence. Other questions? Yeah.
So I'm concerned that Aquinas is here leaning too heavily on his Aristotelian influences, kind of at the expense of teachings he should be getting from Scripture. I'm thinking that, in my opinion, the main thing that Aristotle gets wrong about human nature is that he never connects love to eudaimonia. I think he gets the eudaimonia right, but because he's before Christ, and they didn't really think this way in the ancient world, that he doesn't connect that to love. And I see in Aquinas' idea of the beatification here just a really diminished way of cashing out love. Like, I think love's a really full body thing that requires participation and acting in the world. And I think it even requires other human beings who have kind of incomplete needs who you're able to minister to.
Yeah.
So how do you think Aquinas would think through that?
Well, so some of the defects here might be in my own presentation. I mean, so one thing Aquinas says is in heaven, we will have the fullness of Christian charity. And in fact, he emphasizes that Christian charity will be the only virtue, the only moral virtue that we have. We will dispense with all the normal moral virtues. They won't be necessary anymore. And even the theological virtues of faith and hope will be unnecessary. Right? Faith is belief in things that are unseen, but we'll be seeing God. So no faith in heaven. And hope also is something that seems otiose in heaven, right? There's no need to hope when you are directly beholding God for eternity, right? So he does emphasize charity, as sort of the dominant moral characteristic of human beings in heaven. And so I don't think he's neglecting it. The point that you make about aiding other people who are in need, like doing works of mercy, I think Aquinas would say there's no need for works of mercy in heaven. No one will need assistance, right? Everyone in heaven is utterly satisfied, has everything that he or she needs at all times, permanently. So there's no need to do good works either, right? So some of the purposes of the body in this life, and Aquinas actually says, I mentioned this kind of in passing, he says, even though the contemplative life is inherently preferable to the active life, sometimes we're morally required to pursue the active life in the present life, right? So he says, you might have good moral reasons for not pursuing a life of study, but doing works of mercy in the world. And that seems totally sensible. But that's not what he thinks heaven will be like. There's no need for works of mercy. I will say, as a kind of a more general point, the concern that you have is a concern that's held by some later medieval theologians. So John Duns Scotus often criticizes Aquinas this way. So Scotus, especially in moral theory, will say things like, people quote Aristotle, but he says, but our philosopher St. Paul says that such and such. So basically, Scotus thinks, look, just don't worry about what this pagan thinks about ethics. We don't need to have hero worship of Aristotle. So that there are people who have that view, and maybe you're just sort of a closet Scotist, or maybe maybe not even a closeted Scotus, I don't know. But so maybe your intuitions fit better with him about some of these things. Scotus, it would surprise me, I don't know very much about his views about beatitude. It would surprise me if he didn't emphasize the will a lot more than Aquinas, because he does that everywhere else. So I don't know if that's helpful. I hope.
Can I follow up?
Yeah.
So I'm curious, especially about the first point you were making about charity and he's not sacrificing that's full in heaven. So is he saying that the act of the illuminated intellect contemplating God, that somehow that is generating charity? It's just a different kind of charity that we know in this life, or is charity like this kind of epiphenomenal thing we go through with in addition to contemplating God?
So I would say he thinks God is generating it in us, right? So it is one of the things that God gives to us in heaven. So in addition to this amped up intellect that is enhanced and capable of understanding God's essence. We get a kind of supernatural charity that even transcends the charity that you can get in this life. So you have the fullness of charity, on his view, self-sufficient charity. So one thing I'll mention, and I couldn't really figure out how to work this into the talk, but I think Aquinas didn't just hold this view as kind of an academic exercise. I mean, there's this story, which is taken quite seriously by Catholics, that Aquinas once was praying in a chapel, and there's this sacristan who was sort of nearby, and Aquinas was praying about his work about the Eucharist, and he prayed, Lord, have I written well? And this sacristan is surprised to hear that God answers him, right? And says, yes, you have written well. What would you like as a reward? And what Aquinas says is, he says, Domine non nisi aliam te. Lord, nothing else but yourself, right? So Aquinas, if you take this story seriously, seems to have held this view as a personal view as well, in addition to, sort of academically. When presented with the option, God says, I'll give you anything. He says, I want nothing but yourself, right? So, if Aquinas' piety is any example of something useful here or helpful, you can think of that sort of story. Yes.
Thanks, Jake. It's really fascinating. We haven't talked yet about Trinitarian language, and that may go beyond the scope of what you're prepared to talk about. But the participation in Trinitarian relations is sort of fundamental to the experience that we have. Could you say anything about how intellectual illumination is participation in the word, right? And the fulfillment of charity is full participation in the mission of the Holy Spirit.
Yeah. I mean, so this is something that I want to look more into. I mean, so I have a number of questions about so Aquinas, when he talks about this sort of generically, he seems to have in mind God the Father, right? And I have a number of questions about well, how are we aware of the other persons of the Trinity? And I'm just not really sure what he thinks about that. Presumably, we're aware of Christ in a somewhat different way because he's got a body, and he thinks we can see things in heaven. He makes sometimes offhanded remarks about this. He says well, maybe we'll see the other blessed in heaven, but he doesn't seem to think that that's super important. But it might be more important when it comes to the person of Christ to be able to see him physically. And I suspect there are sort of analogous questions about the Holy Spirit. So I really don't know what he thinks about that, but that's a helpful question that I could look into more. Do you have views
Well, I'm just
about
thinking
that?
of the way that in this life we participate in those, or at least the analogy that he draws for Trinitarian processions in questions 27 in the first part. The proper analogy for that is in the human intellect, but he's not only doing Trinitarian analogies when he's doing that, he's also doing epistemology, but he's also doing what is it to be human, right? The imago Dei person. Mm-hmm. And so the fulfillment of the imago Dei, both historically and it would seem in eternal life, would be an ongoing participation in those particular sets of relations. Yeah. I mean, so there's a kind of a long tradition of thinking of the imago Dei in terms of the three persons. And I just don't know enough about what he thinks about that, but that's something interesting that I'm interested in looking into. So I appreciate you bringing that up. Other thoughts or questions? Yeah.
So in defense of the newly formed Dominican order, which was controversial at the time, I know Aquinas argues that the contemplative life flowing over into the active life is the best kind of life. I was wondering, is this like a mere moral, like, is this done a mere moral obligation, or is there something more to that? And is this view reconcilable with Aristotle's, or is it sort of kind of branched off?
So, regarding the first bit of the question, I'm not as familiar with Aquinas' participation in these controversies about, how monastic orders should live. But I remember when, so he's got a question on the contemplative life. He's actually got a few questions on the contemplative life and the active life, pairing them. And I remember reading this thinking like, surely he's got to have in mind some of these questions about how monastic orders should live. And he does say the contemplative life is superior in itself, but he's sure to add in there that there might be moral reasons for pursuing the active life in a given case. And I think he has in mind not only the consecrated life of different religious orders, but just think of the average Catholic, right? Most people have all kinds of social considerations that they have to think about, and so much so that we often, on Aquinas' view, confuse that with what the best kind of beatitude is, right? Now, the part about Aristotle is, the scholars actually disagree about whether Aristotle really prefers the contemplative life or the active life. So, I've argued here that he clearly prefers the contemplative life because he says it's the best, right? So he explicitly says it's the most choice. But other people will say, look, in books 2 through 9, he develops an extremely sophisticated account of the civic life or the political life. And so why would he spend so much time focused on that if he thought that it was an inferior kind of life? And so I think, there are interesting scholarly questions there. I'm not sure that I can totally settle them, except to say it seems to me clear that he prefers the life of scholarship or the life of contemplation in light of what he says about it. Maybe David could.
Well, I wanted to say, isn't that's related to the heart of your talk, which is insofar as Aristotle is a hylomorphist and not a substance dualist, he doesn't think that, well, the real objective is to do what you have to do in this life and get along, and then do what the human person really is supposed to do, which is you escape the body and you engage in this. So the reason he's torn is precisely because he thinks to be human is to be embodied. And so I think you gave the right account in the content of your talk, where you said he has this view that that the life of virtue, the life of action, is the human good, except that where we can, we want to strain toward. There's that passage, this weird, that's an Irwin translation, of this idea of being pro-immortal or divinizing or moving toward God, theos. And that seems to be exactly right. And notice how, I think a question I have is, how does this is a part of a series on human nature, right? So how does the argument that you've made really, how is that grounded in his theory of human nature? And I think this is a way to provide at least part of an answer. If Thomas believes that we are resurrected in perfect bodies, then this is an irony, right? The irony is that in perfect bodies, the body will no longer be an obstacle to the very best of goods. And so, strangely enough, having a perfect body enables us to set aside all of those partial goods, right?
Yeah, that's what I think he thinks.
Can you speak to that, or?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I have like a lot more to say, except there's this tendency, I think, in the scholarship to say, well, look, Aquinas is an hylomorphist, and so he's got to have a prominent role for the body and happiness. And that is true in this life. But he also thinks like humans are made in the image of God, right? And that we should become like God, and that we need to become like God in order to achieve our final happiness, right? And so that is relevant to his theory of human nature, right? His view about what fulfills human beings, what we are ordered towards, does kind of sideline the body. And, I think we should acknowledge that, or it's fair to acknowledge that, even though he is a hylomorphist.
So another way to ask the question is, why doesn't he discard the hylomorphism then? If he really
Yeah.
believes that the highest good is this good of contemplating God for eternity.
I mean, I think there are two kinds of reasons. One is that the Christian views about the body, in particular the resurrection of the body, are so definitive that there's just no way that he can be a theologically orthodox Christian and say that we're identical to our immortal soul. So I think, maybe that doesn't commit us strictly to hylomorphism, but I think it's really hard as a theologically orthodox Christian to say we are identical to an immaterial soul. And so I think it's clear that Aquinas thinks that. I also think he's got philosophically different kinds of philosophical motivations for being a hylomorphist in general. So, Aquinas agrees with Aristotle that if you want to give a coherent account of change in the natural world, you need to believe in form and matter, and believe that, matter is a kind of continuant for change, that forms come and go within matter. So, Aquinas thinks that material objects in general are composites of form and matter. And so it would be odd if human beings were the only exception to this in the natural world, right? So, I think he thinks he's got philosophical reasons for being a hylomorphist. And he's got theological reasons for thinking that human beings, are, are animals. We've got bodies, and we need to have a resurrected body. So it's a kind of a combination of theological and philosophical commitments that drive him to this view, which I think initially seems kind of puzzling, but I hope I've gone some way towards sort of dispelling the mystery there. Yeah.
I know sometimes primarily focus on the vision, but it's kind of related to the body aspect of the argument.
Yeah.
This question is more biological, and I'm just wondering, you were using the kidney earlier as a fully functioning kidney, a good kidney, it's one that functions, filtering the blood. And so in heaven, since there's no food, it's so would a lot of the normal body function, would it still function normally naturally, or is there characteristics of our perfect bodies to kind of operate differently than how our natural bodies work?
Yeah, I mean, so I think it's clear that Aquinas thinks we won't have a metabolism, right? We won't need to eat. It won't be like, hang on, I need to take a break from contemplating the divine essence. I'm gonna go defecate, right? Nothing like that. That's not what.
No bathrooms.
Yeah, no bathrooms in heaven, right? Right. So I don't think he thinks that we're gonna have those same kinds of needs. We'll have an incorruptible body, he says, and so we won't need to eat.
It'll just be operated differently.
Yeah.
But isn't that the key term, incorruption? Because the incorruptible part also points to the shift from a material substrate that experiences and understands in a diachronic way to a spiritual substrate that's still bodily, but spiritual, not material.
It's sort of, yeah. So this
therefore can understand synchronically, more like what angels are, but we don't become angels.
Yeah, so he says our understanding is more like angels, but I want to emphasize that he really is insistent that our bodies are material. So it depends on what you mean by spirit. If you mean by spiritual that our bodies are immaterial, he rejects that. He insists that they are material, he says in the same way that Christ's resurrected body is material. And he says, and Christ eats, right, in after his resurrection, and people touch him, right? So we will have the same kind of body. We won't need to eat, but we could, right, if we wanted to. And someone could touch us if they wanted to. Yeah. I'm not really sure that I completely understand Aquinas' views on this. And this sort of gets back to some of the Trinitarian questions that we had earlier. So I just don't, I just don't know the answer. Yeah.
Isn't another approach to the problem of the body being resurrected and being in heaven be that the body being part of how we experience happiness and delight on earth, and being part of our hylomorphic human nature, we will be necessary in heaven. As I said, it's part of our human nature, even more than that, it seemed like perhaps that the body won't add to quantity of happiness per se, but perhaps the quality of beatitude in heaven by being able to, I guess, in a certain sense, receive God through the body.
So this is an interesting question. I don't recall Aquinas anywhere saying that we receive God through the body, but there is a sense in which he seems to say that it somehow accrues to our good to have a body. But he wants to say that that doesn't contribute to our beatitude, because in fact we could have beatitude without a body. But somehow where we are better, or the world is better, if we have a body. And so, like, one thing that comes out in Aquinas' discussion of the interim state, and I'll say that there's an enormous literature on the interim state, so I'm not really a master of that literature, but one thing that comes out in his discussion of the interim state is that Aquinas thinks it's kind of unnatural for us to be without a body. So even though the immortal soul can survive without a body, it's a subsistent being, it's essentially ordered to a body. And so when we are in the interim state, we're sort of in an unnatural state. We're ordered to a body. And, you know, even though we don't actually strictly need it for beatitude. And he says, and I'm not really sure how to translate this, but that it somehow contributes to our well-being to have a body. But he wants to insist that it doesn't contribute to our beatitude, right? So I'm not completely sure how I'm supposed to make sense of that. There's some other sense of well-being that's not connected to our beatitude, but that nevertheless having a body contributes.
Explain the interim state.
So
everyone probably understands.
So Aquinas and a lot of other Catholic theologians think that when you die, there's this period of time before your body is resurrected where your immortal soul exists. And this isn't purgatory, because I think in purgatory you have a body, but you've got this disembodied soul but no body. And then when the resurrection of the dead happens, you get your body back and it becomes a glorified body. And there's this academic literature about like how we should understand the identity of the human person that has no body. Do you cease to be human? Because in some passages, Aquinas seems to think that you're essentially as a human being embodied. So some people think you cease to be human. Some people think you individually cease to exist, but your soul continues to exist. So there are all kinds of weird views. And I don't have like a stake in that debate. But Aquinas does think there's some sense in which it's good for you to have a body. Your nature is, I'm hesitant to say your nature is fulfilled, because that sounds like beatitude. And he wants to say it's not the same as beatitude, but it accrues to your good somehow. Yeah.
So I'm wondering if he has anything to say about the Blessed Virgin Mary and her assumption into heaven. Then is her body glorified, not having gone through the process of death and then being reunited with the soul, or even like Elijah and Enoch were alive,
Yeah.
still in there.
I'm sure he has something to say about this. I don't want to wade too much into theological controversies about the Assumption of Mary. And one thing I'll say is that here's another thing is a lot of the official doctrinal commitments about the Assumption of Mary came after Aquinas. But it would surprise me if he thought she didn't have a glorified body. I would be shocked by that.
Yeah, sure.
Sure.
It's kind of off the weeds.
My hope for this talk is, if nothing else, not to lead people into theological error. So hopefully at minimum I've satisfied that.
Yes, just kind of going off that point, what's the relationship between the Aquinas' views here and Catholic dogmatics? How much of this do Catholics need to accept? How much of it is optional?
That's a hard question. Like if you look in the catechism on heaven, I think wisely it's a limited discussion. And so, but I'm not really an expert about that. I mean, I take it Catholics are committed to believing in heaven. They absolutely are committed to believing in the resurrection of the dead, right? And then presumably there's some kind of commitment to heaven involving knowing God and being in a relationship to God. Beyond that, what the specific theological commitments of, dogmatic commitments of Catholic theology about heaven are, I'm not really sure I could say. I will say that there was hot disagreement about beatitude in medieval philosophy and theology. So, you can see an indication of that just from how Aquinas talks about it and how many objections he considers for alternative opinions. I'd be interested to look at, for example, what Scotus has to say about beatitude. Probably is more will oriented. And so usually Catholic dogma about these kinds of things tries to take into account reasonable disagreement among different theologians. And it wouldn't surprise me if in this case. I don't know, maybe, do you know the answer? Okay.
I do think on sort of bouncing off that question, given that this is part of a series on human nature, I think it's really interesting that while many Catholics and many Christians more broadly intuitively find a dualist conception of human nature appealing, the centrality of resurrection, and indeed the very problem that you're addressing in your talk, suggests that a hylomorphic, or we might call it a unified soul-body theory or a holistic soul-body theory seems at least, I mean, we have to deal with arguments about qualifications and so forth, but it actually seems much more in line with or aligned with or consistent with a Christian outlook because of the centrality of the resurrection in Christianity. So Christians don't hold to a view of the survival of the soul as we find in Plato, or a view of the independent existence of a mind as we find in Descartes, for example. Even though Descartes is a Catholic thinker, I realize that. But it shows actually the problem you're addressing is a problem about a holistic conception of the human person as both body and soul, which fits better with the emphasis that we find on resurrection in the New Testament, it seems. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, that seems plausible to me. Yeah, I mean, I do think, and I don't want to say that I've thought through this really carefully, but it seems to me that there are some prominent theological problems that would arise from trying to hold a substance dualist account, in the context of understanding Christian views about the resurrection. So I'm not saying that someone can't be a Christian in good faith and be a substance dualist, but I do think that it's harder, or it maybe doesn't lend itself quite as naturally to Christian views about the resurrection. So I think, that's part of why Aquinas is a hylomorphist. I think he has independent philosophical reasons for it too. But any other thoughts or questions? This is exciting. So yeah.
Another objection. So I think we talked briefly about the image of God being meaningful to Aquinas, and he wants to maintain our imitation and imaging of who God is and his activities. It seems like a really important activity that God has and will continue to have in heaven is creative activity. He's going to continue maintaining all of creation. So it seems like if we're just saying, contemplating God is all we're doing, we're not leaving room for human beings creating things.
Yeah, no, this is an interesting question. Now I will say, Aquinas, strictly speaking, doesn't think human beings create if what you mean is creating from nothing. but we are active in the world. We do things, we have effects in the world. But I think he's willing to bite the bullet there and say, no, we don't have any external activity in heaven, or at least it's not a prominent part of our experience in heaven and our happiness. And the reason is that there's no need that we could satisfy by doing these things, right? You know, so we talked earlier about works of mercy, and Aquinas surely thinks works of mercy are meritorious, but if there's no need to perform them, you know, we won't perform them, right? So we won't do things that have no purpose in heaven.
I think we're out of time. Hey, thanks for wrapping up the year for us. Let's thank our speaker.